It's an honor to be back with the Ripon Society. What a great group. I've always enjoyed being with you all. Such an influential group of people, and we're so grateful. I'm also very grateful to be with my colleague, Congressman Gonzalez. I don't say this lightly, and I'm not just blowing smoke. This is not just a jock, okay? This guy is the most intelligent, thoughtful member to join the Financial Services Committee and the Congress in a long, long time, and we are so fortunate to have his not just his horsepower on the football field, but his brain power. This guy is an incredibly influential member of the committee, and it's an honor to serve with him. I want to introduce my special guests, Eleanor and Mary Clay, my two daughters who are here with us, and thanks for supporting. Appreciate it. Look, this is a big issue. This is, I think, the biggest issue facing our country right now is the looming threat from China. It's a generational challenge that we have, and I'm honored to serve on two committees that really have jurisdictional influence on this issue. The Financial Services Committee and having the ability to be the ranking member of the National Security Subcommittee, where we have oversight over Treasury. And we're going to talk today about the economic competition that we have with the People's Republic of China. But also now on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And in the last Congress, Leader McCarthy appointed me to serve on the House China Task Force. We wanted it to be bipartisan. The leader approached Speaker Pelosi about making it bipartisan. When the pandemic hit, we thought it was even more important to make it a bipartisan effort, and for whatever reason, the Speaker declined to include Democrat members. But in the end, we had 15 members, all Republicans, stretching across 11 committees of jurisdiction. We produced 400 serious policy recommendations. A third of those have already been implemented, and over half of them were bipartisan. So even though the composition of the task force was only Republican, we took suggestions and recommendations from our Democrat colleagues and took them seriously. This is not a partisan issue. It should be and needs to be a bipartisan issue, and we are working across the aisle. We had a unfortunate partisan vote in the Foreign Affairs Committee with the markup of the Eagle Act, but I'm hopeful that at the end of the day, when we look at the CHIPS Act, when we look at this upgrade of the National Science Foundation, when we look at the needs that we have to improve our supply chain resiliency, that we will get a bipartisan solution in the end in this Congress to some of these important pressing questions. Today I want to focus on our approach, emerging approach to capital flows, because this is the sticky issue, right? To counter the China threat, I've always said you can't beat China by becoming China. We don't want to emulate China's theft of intellectual property. It's socialism with China characteristics. We don't want to emulate their central planning model. We want to embrace our values of free markets and capitalism and free enterprise. But how do we do that when we're facing an adversary that engages in malign foreign investment, stealing our intellectual property, stealing our technology, using our capital markets not as we thought they were going to use them 40 years ago when we engaged China? And this is a larger point, but when we, on both sides of the aisle over the last 40 years, when the United States engaged China over the past 40 years in different administrations, we thought, and we had good intentions, we thought that engagement with the People's Republic of China, that introducing them to our Western values, introducing them to the principles of capitalism and free markets, that they would evolve, that they would change, that they would embrace not only democratization, but reforms that would lead to human rights and basic acceptance of the international rules. That was not the case, and unfortunately, especially with the new reign of Xi Jinping, we see China using the United States and Western markets to fuel their civil-military fusion, their malign conduct. There's a whole discussion about the origins of COVID, and we can talk about that. But I think the pandemic was a wake-up call on a whole range of issues, and the economic competition is one that I think is most pressing for me on both the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Financial Services Committee. So how do we approach this? How do we maintain our values? How do we be consistent about cross-border capital flows and free markets while at the same time not contributing to the rise of China and its malign activities, whether it's abuses in human rights, whether it's the theft of our intellectual property, whether it's using our capital markets to build up their military and their intelligence and surveillance state? Well, there's different ways that we've looked at this, right? I mean, in the last Congress, Senator Kennedy, and in the House, Congressman Sherman had a bill, and we ultimately enacted it in the NDAA at the end of last Congress to use our accounting standard setting apparatus from the Sarbanes-Oxley era, the PCOAB, to say, look, there's an investor protection issue. We don't want Chinese listed companies to not be subject to the same rules that U.S. companies are. And that if you're going to list on U.S. exchanges and you're going to put U.S. investors at risk, you need to live by the same Sarbanes-Oxley rules. You need to have the same accounting standards. And you have to have the transparency that U.S. listed companies have. Seems like a reasonable approach. We passed the bill, bipartisan, and the implementation of that is underway. I will say I've been getting updates, and the Biden administration is slow walking this. The Gensler SEC is really not prioritizing this. They're more interested in ESG and other issues that frankly don't have a legislative authorization. But we do have legislative authorization and a directive to the SEC to take this issue seriously, but they're not moving with haste, unfortunately. At the end of the day, even if they were moving it at haste, I don't think that this is really the approach that's going to get at the core of the problem. The problem is not just investor protection. The problem is national security. The problem is that if U.S. investors find themselves providing capital to companies that threaten our national security, whether it's on the telecommunications side with Huawei, or whether it's a company that has connections with the CCP and the People's Liberation Army, Americans should not be in the business of fueling the rise of a Chinese surveillance state and their military. That's certainly what we want to avoid. So when we look at using the securities laws or the accounting standards, we really don't think that makes a lot of sense. That's like coming to a gunfight with a knife. We want to go to the gunfight with a gun. And so looking at this, we want to differentiate the issues of securities disclosure from a national security imperative. And that's why we think OFAC is the right approach to this. So we're going to be introducing a bill next week that will be using our sanctions power, the power of the Treasury, which frankly has not been utilized to great effect, to give OFAC the ability to sanction any company on the entity list that President Trump initiated under his executive order that has connections to the CCP or the People's Liberation Army or the civil military fusion in China. Sanction those companies so that U.S. investors have clarity, certainty, whether or not, and also all of these exchanges and ETFs and the various mutual funds, that they cannot include these companies in their funds. And we're doing this through the sanctions process at OFAC, not just because we think it's a national security issue, but also because it's more effective than using the securities regulation. Securities will push a lot of these Chinese listed companies just to other foreign exchanges, whereas if we use OFAC, we can have a multilateral impact. And I think that's very important. And Bob is here from the U.S. China Economic Security Commission. Appreciate you being here. And if we're getting this wrong, let us know. We're taking a lot of advice from this commission which is a customer of the Congress, and they were set up when we let China into the WTO. We were hoping that when we brought China into the nation, the world of nations and trade, that would change them. That has not happened, and they've unfortunately continued their malign economic warfare with the United States. So I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we face is engaging on this issue where China is manipulating access to our capital markets to fuel their civil military fusion. We need to get this right. We need to encourage cross-border exchange. We need to encourage capitalism and free markets around the globe. But when there's a national security threat like this, we need to send a clear signal, not through our securities regulation, but through the power of U.S. sanctions and our economic tools that we have at the U.S. Treasury. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Anthony, and look forward to any questions you all might have. Thank you very much.
Well, good to be with you all. First off, thank you for having me. Great to be here. I think this is the first time I've spoken at Ripon. I've certainly attended other events, but it truly is an honor, and it is an honor to sit next to my friend Andy Barr. When you come into Congress, from my background, which had nothing to do with Congress, but when you come into Congress and you get onto the Financial Services Committee, it's a little intimidating at first, and you go into your first markup and you just want to sort of feel it out and see how it's going to operate, and you notice that there are some people who can just argue like crazy, and in a good way, in a productive way, in a thoughtful way, and can put the other side on the defensive, which is how good policy is made. If you're going to put something out there and you're going to make it law, we should have a robust debate. We should hash out the major issues and make sure that we all understand what's going on here. And on our side, we've got some great ones. But Andy has always been somebody that I look to and think to myself, how do you do it that way? But it feels like I'm watching my cousin Vinny in some respects. When Vincent Lombardi at Gambini undermines the entire case, I feel like I'm watching that at times with Andy. I mean that as a sincere compliment. But in any event, so it's an honor to be here with him. In terms of China, the way I think about it is I ask myself three questions, and then from these three questions, a strategy emerges. First one is, who is China? Who is the Chinese Communist Party? The second is, what do they want? And how are they trying to get it, is the third. So who are they, what do they want, and how are they playing the game? Who are they? I think we all know at this point. If it hasn't been made clear, it's a totalitarian communist regime that doesn't believe in human rights, that doesn't believe in a democratic process, and that will do anything that they can to achieve their aims. So that's who they are. What do they want? On the China Task Force, which I was also on last Congress and on again this Congress, I asked that question to some of the most senior administration officials, some of the top folks in the State Department and National Security Council, and everybody to a person basically said the same thing. Because I would ask them, I said, does China want a unipolar world or a multipolar world? Do they think that we can coexist, or do they think that they need to be at the center and everything feeds up through them? And every single person said they want a unipolar world. They're not interested in coexisting with an American capitalist system or a Western democratic system. That is not what they want. They want their system to be the dominant system that informs all of global commerce, defense, and all of the international institutions. And then how do they play? How do they play the game? They go with what they call a total systems approach, which is all-encompassing. It's defense, it's economic, it's technological, it's propaganda, information warfare. All of society for the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in this struggle that they believe will ultimately end with them at the top of the global pyramid and the rest of us sort of serving underneath them. So if that's who they are, that's what they want, and that's how they play, I would argue that the things that we can comfortably collaborate on, that Venn diagram becomes somewhat narrow, certainly narrower than it's been. And anything related to defense, national defense certainly, is something that we should be considerate of. But I also think when you get into things like these Confucius Institutes that have been on our college campuses, basically whitewashing the Chinese Communist Party to American college students, I think that's something that we need to take seriously, and certainly in the economic sphere as well. Where I've chosen to focus because of my committee assignments is to basically say, okay, so what's my role here if we have this total systems warfare, Cold Warfare of sorts playing out? I think we similarly need that type of strategy at our level in the Congress and hopefully in the administration. That's why I've been so pleased to be on the China Task Force. I think it's so important because that is its central aim, is to define the U.S.-China policy for the country for the next decade plus, however long it takes. And so it really does require everyone. And what I've done in the first sort of round is focus on the Confucius Acts. So we had the Confucius Act in, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which was the PCAOB piece of legislation that Andy described, and then a World Bank provision. So again, one of the things that China has done is infiltrate all the international organizations. So the UN, the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, in large measure have been, I would argue, corrupted, but certainly ideologically taken over in many ways by China. And so we passed a bill that would go after them at the World Bank and force them to graduate from what's called the loan program, which is a way that they can get discounted loans to fund upwards, I think it was a $500 million loan to Xinjiang, where the Uyghur Muslims are. The World Bank underwrote that loan, which means that the U.S. taxpayer underwrote that loan, which I don't think most people realize. But one thing we passed was to kick them out of the loan program, graduate them from the loan program so that U.S. taxpayers aren't funding Chinese initiatives indirectly, but still in an important way. And I was happy to get those through. The two that I'm working on this Congress, one that Jen mentioned is the Data Act. And what the Data Act would do is it would create a fusion center essentially at the Department of Commerce whereby all Chinese data could be housed, synthesized, analyzed, and then presented back to the relevant agencies. One thing that's really difficult with China that I've noticed is because of how they run their country, it is really difficult to get reliable data out of China. And that's public sector and private sector. And it actually was the most stark when I read a classified briefing, which I obviously can't share what was in it, but when I read a classified briefing on an issue related to China, and you compare how detailed that is, which wasn't very detailed, compared to what we can get on some other threats to our country when you read those classified reports, and you realize, okay, clearly we have a good handle on this particular entity because I feel like I'm basically in the meeting with these folks, as opposed to reading something on a China where you go, wait a minute, we just don't have the information we need. And so part of fighting any battle is being able to understand the lay of the land. And so the Data Act is designed to do that. And then the second one is the China Financial Threat Mitigation Act, which would require FSOC to expand current reporting requirements to our financial regulators to make sure that there aren't systemic financial risks associated with China's shadow banking sector. So not to get your eyes glazed over, but shadow banking, a lot of the banking that takes place in China is done off book, if you will. And as a result, when you have an economy that's that large and that powerful, it's hard to understand what systemic risks might be out there associated with that. So two sort of data plays designed specifically to just get a better understanding of our adversary as we move forward. But the most important thing, frankly, in my view, is that this doesn't become a partisan issue. I've been reasonably okay with what President Biden has said with respect to China. I haven't seen the follow-through. It's the same problem I have with his Cuba stance. It's like, nice tweet. I actually need you to go do something. But separate to that, it's going to take a concerted effort across party lines, across multiple administrations, and probably for the rest of our life. I don't. Maybe by the time your kids are older, we won't be dealing with it. But I think for For everyone else in this room, this is with us. It's with us for a long time. And we need to make sure that we're prepared and we understand the threat and that we're able to articulate an American strategy and a strategy for the world that will keep Western democratic values at the forefront and not the values of the Chinese Communist Party, which is what they want. So with that, I will yield back, as we say, and thank you again for having us.
Great.